Next up is our colleague Adam Roach. I was really lucky to get to work with Adam on an important project several years ago, and we've kept in touch since then, and I've sat in on this training a few times. He's here tonight representing the Attorney General's office, which is also a good reminder for me to remind folks that there's a town hall with Attorney General Nerona, which I have to say I think is probably the coolest event that's going to happen this year. It's on the 21st. You'll get some information on it in the slide deck. That's now open to everybody, not just RIMS and ACP members. They were able to ensure access for everybody. So thank you to your colleagues at the Attorney General's office for joining us at that event, Adam, and welcome, and the floor is yours until 7:18.
Thank you, my friend. So a word of warning, this training is usually an hour and a half on the OMA. So I'm going to really hit the highlights here. And I got some good guidance from Lauren, so I'll stick to the script. But what is the OMA? The OMA is basically a public transparency law. It goes hand in hand with the APRA, which governs public records. I work at the Attorney General's office. I mostly do open government. I practice in a different area of law as well. But this office, for the most part, enforces both of those statutes. So we receive complaints from members of the public. We're quasi-judicial. I'm like a judge. I review the record. I issue a finding. So we're going to stick to the OMA tonight. So basically what it means is that it's kind of just how it sounds. If you have a meeting, it needs to be open to the public. And that's because if something's impacting someone's life, they should be able to view that in real time for the most part and know what's going on. So there's a three-legged stool with the OMA. If all three of these elements need to be present in order for the OMA to be implicated and therefore for the law to kick into place. There needs to be a meeting, a quorum of a public body conducting a meeting. So the easiest part of this is a quorum. A quorum is just a majority membership of the public body. A meeting is the second easiest part of this. A meeting is just that the public body needs to be discussing something that's within their purview as a public body. So say, a public body convenes, but they just discuss the Boston Red Sox and they do not discuss whatever the purpose of their whole public body is. Technically, although there's some issues there with the optics of that and whether it appears to be transparent, from the letter of the law, that would not be subject to the OMA because they're not discussing their entire purpose for being a public body. They're discussing something ancillary, something non-related. So that wouldn't count as a meeting. They have to discuss kind of the purpose of why they're there. And then whether an entity is a public body, that is a more complicated question. And it's a question that I also get asked a lot. So if there's any other area of the OMA, I could probably say yay or nay. But whether an entity is subject to the OMA and is a public body is a multi-factor test. So you need to take into account a number of factors with respect to that entity and make a determination as to whether it's subject to the OMA. So some things that might steer it away from being the OMA. If the membership changes every single week, or every meeting. So one meeting, X amount of members show up and they're all different. The next meeting, different members. They're probably not subject to the OMA. Same, the regularity of the meetings. So they just kind of have random meetings all the time. There's no regularity to them. Probably not subject to the OMA. They don't have any sort of like governing instrument. They're not in a charter. They're not in a statute. They're not in a regulation. They don't have the ability to make any sort of determinative, they're advisory in nature, for example. They just kind of come up with ideas. They can't really enforce anything themselves, likely not subject to the OMA. But there are a number of factors. We need to take them all into account. And the only way really to test that is for a complaint to be filed to our office and we can make a determination, or for the entity to request an advisory opinion where the entity says, can you tell us if we're subject to the OMA? Which takes some time because we're like a court system. We need to get through to all these different complaints and everything. But the advice I give folks in the interim is that if you think you're subject to the OMA, to just follow the strictures of the OMA, which, yes, we get a lot of complaints about the OMA, but when you really get down to brass tacks, it's not too onerous. You need to post agendas. You need to be open unless you're going to executive session. If you're going into executive session, that just means a closed meeting. You need to do it per statute. There needs to be a certain statute that you need to reference. For example, if you're going to discuss litigation, right? You don't want to discuss that publicly. That's secret. The opposite side of the litigation would get that information if it was held in a public meeting. You need to cite to that provision of the statute that says it's about litigation. And then you need to give a brief description. We are discussing this case. Obviously, you don't want to discuss too much in depth on the agenda because then you would defeat the entire purpose of having an executive session. Lastly, you need to post a agenda or supplemental notice that gives people, fair notice of what's going to be discussed. So I have a silly analogy that I use, not sanctioned by the AG's office, but say that you're like a freakish fan of the movie Titanic, right? You love Titanic. Well, if the public body was going to put on their agenda, we're going to show a brief footage of a vessel, right? I wouldn't know that that's the movie Titanic. But if you said we're showing Titanic the movie, therefore, okay, I know to show up and watch Titanic the movie. And I'll take that analogy and think about something that impacts your life. Zoning change, something that impacts your property. But I'm over time, but I'll stick around for questions and go to our website, riag.gov, for more of this information.
Thanks, Adam. Mostly what I wanted folks to know was that the Open Meeting Act exists, especially because Stacy DeCola, who we're going to move to next, is going to show us how to look up meetings and agendas that are subject to the Open Meeting Act. Before Adam takes off, does anybody have any last-minute questions for Adam? Or if not, seeing none, Adam, thank you so much. It's nice to see you. I appreciate your flexibility tonight. We'll roll over to Stacy